On the 2nd of February 1943, a British bomber came down in a Dutch field about 8 miles southeast of Rotterdam. 5 of the 7 men aboard were killed. 2 were taken prisoner. German soldiers reached the wreck quickly, and what they pulled out of the belly of that aircraft was a block of copper roughly the size of a thermos flask. For months, Admiral Karl Dönitz had been asking a question that nobody could answer. His submarines were being found. Not always sunk, not yet, but found, in weather that should have hidden them, in darkness that had belonged to them since the first day of the war. He had asked his scientists. They had told him what he wanted to hear, and what they honestly believed, which was that the thing he feared could not be built. Within weeks, the thing he feared was lying on a workbench in Berlin, under a magnifying glass, in a room full of the best microwave engineers in Germany. Here is what makes this worth your time. The men who took that copper block apart understood it almost at once. They wrote down exactly what it meant. Every word they wrote was correct, and it saved no one, because the answer arrived before the question did, and by the time the question finally came, the answer had already stopped mattering. Least of all to the Admiral's youngest son. If you're one of the generation that remembers these stories, we're honored you're here. What year were you born? On the 30th of January 1943, Karl Dönitz put on the uniform of a Grand Admiral for the first time. He was 51 years old. He had fought the First War from inside a submarine, had been sunk in the Mediterranean, had been fished out of the water by the British, and held in a prison camp in England, where he had spent months acting like a man losing his mind so they would send him home early. It had worked. He had come back to a defeated country with no navy and no submarines, and over 20 years he had built the most feared weapon in the Atlantic out of almost nothing at all. Now Erich Raeder was gone, pushed out after a humiliating failure in the Arctic, and the entire German Navy belonged to Dönitz. He did not take it the way a man takes a reward. He kept the older title, the one that actually meant something to him, commander of the submarines, and he handed the daily running of the boats to his operations chief, Eberhard Gott. Then he went and did what he had done nearly every morning for 3 years. He walked to the plot and looked at the pins. The pins were the war, reduced to something a man could hold in his eye at once. Red for his boats, blue for enemy convoys, black for the ones that had not come home. And on that morning, standing at the summit of his career, Karl Dönitz was carrying a question he could not put down. To understand the question, you have to go out into the Bay of Biscay on a winter night in 1942, aboard a submarine running on the surface in the dark. This is where the boats crossed. Every patrol out of the French ports, Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, had to cross the bay to reach the Atlantic, and every patrol home had to cross it again. On the surface, a submarine of that era made about 17 knots. Underwater it made 7, and only for a little while, and then the batteries died and it had to come up whether the crew liked it or not. So the bay was crossed at night, on the surface, diesels hammering, salt water breaking green over the bow. The men on the bridge stood in the cold with their binoculars, and one of them held onto a wooden cross. That is not a figure of speech. It was a frame of wood, roughly the shape of a crucifix, wound with wire, and it was wired down through the hatch to a receiver below. The crews called it the Biscay Cross. It was an aerial, and it was ugly, and it was handmade, and it had to be carried up through the conning tower by a man every time the boat surfaced, and carried back down by a man every time the boat dived, because it would snap off otherwise. Down at the bottom of that wire sat a small French-built receiver the Germans called Mitox, and what Mitox did was listen. British aircraft hunting submarines carried radar. To find you, the radar had to shout at you. It threw out a pulse of radio energy, and it waited for the echo to come back off your hull, and it painted you on a screen. But a radar cannot shout without being heard. Mitox heard the shout. So this is what a night in the bay actually sounded like. Diesels, water, the wind, and then, out of a speaker below, a tick, then another tick, then ticks running together into a rattle, faster and faster and louder as the aircraft closed, and the officer on the bridge did not need a translation. He put his mouth to the voice tube, and the alarm went, and the man with the wooden cross came down the ladder with it in his arms, and the hatch slammed and the boat went under. And 30 seconds later a British bomber came howling through empty air over a patch of ocean with nothing on it but a swirl of foam. It worked. That is the part that gets left out. It worked so well that from November of 1942 through January of 1943, across 3 full months of winter, British aircraft patrolling the Bay of Biscay did not sink a single German submarine. Not one. The boats were crossing in greater numbers than ever. The aircraft were flying more hours than ever, and they came home with nothing, again and again, until the Royal Air Force wrote down in its own records, in its own words, that its offensive in the bay had for a time been defeated. Think about what that does to a man like Nimitz. His engineers had handed him a box the size of a suitcase, and it had shut down the entire British air campaign over his front door. German science had looked at the problem and solved it. The evidence was 3 months of empty British patrol reports. Which is exactly why the other thing made no sense. Because out past the bay, out in the gray middle of the Atlantic where the convoys ran, something was happening that Nimitz could not explain. Convoys were turning. Not by accident, and not in the way a convoy turns to zigzag, but cleanly, decisively, in the night, hours before his wolf packs reached them, as though someone aboard those merchant ships had been handed a map with his submarines drawn on it. His boats would run all night on the surface to the interception point and arrive at dawn to find open water and an empty horizon. Then the pack would be redirected and it would happen again and again. And sometimes a boat simply reported an aircraft where an aircraft had no business being 1,000 miles from any coast, arriving overhead within hours of a radio transmission, circling, waiting. Nimitz had a mind built for exactly this kind of problem. He was not a romantic and he was not a fool. He looked at the pattern and he came to a conclusion that was, in the most important sense, correct. The enemy could see him. So he asked. Through the winter he brought in Germany's radar men and put the question to them directly. Is there a radar we cannot hear? Is there a radar working on a wavelength Nimitz does not cover? And they told him no. You need to understand that they were not lying to him, and they were not stupid, and they were not flattering a superior. They were telling him what German physics believed, and German physics had reasons. Radar in that era worked on wavelengths measured in meters. Nimitz listened across the meter band, and that band was where radar lived, because that was where you could actually generate power. To go shorter, down to wavelengths measured in centimeters, you needed a device that could pour enormous energy into an extremely high frequency, and every valve and tube available to European engineering choked long before it got there. You could make centimetric waves. You could make them at a whisper. You could not make them at a shout. And a radar that whispers is a radar that finds nothing. That was not superstition. That was the accepted state of the art in the most advanced technical nation on the continent. And there is a detail here that turns the whole thing from an error into something closer to a tragedy. The Germans had already built the answer. Years before the war, in the 1930s, German laboratories had experimented with the very type of device that would eventually solve the problem. They had it in their hands. They studied it, they measured it, they considered what it might be worth in a war, and they concluded that the effort was not justified by the return. So they put it down, and they walked away, and they went and built the best meter wavelength radar in the world instead. They had not failed to invent it. They had decided it was not worth inventing. So the experts told the admiral that the thing he was afraid of did not exist, and they told him with total sincerity, and Nimitz, who suspected they were wrong, had nothing to argue with except a feeling and a plot board full of black pins. Here is the part that nobody in that room could have known, and it is the reason the whole search was doomed before it started. In the winter of 1942, The hole in the German position was not a machine at all. It was the code. The German Navy sent its orders by radio, enciphered on a machine the crews trusted absolutely. In February of 1942, the Navy had added a fourth rotor to that machine and gone dark, and for most of a year, the British codebreakers had been locked out and blind and desperate. Then, in December of 1942, they got back in. From that point, a growing share of what Nimitz said to his boats was also being read by men in a hut in the English countryside, sometimes within hours. The convoy that turned in the night had turned because someone in London had been handed the position of the patrol line waiting for it. There was no miracle sensor. There was a paper trail leading straight out of Donitz's own transmitter. And so the Grand Admiral, standing at his plot looking at the pattern, drew the right conclusion from the wrong evidence, and went hunting for a radar. The terrible thing, the thing that makes this story sit in your chest, is that he was going to find one. On the night of the 2nd of February 1943, a Royal Air Force bomber crossed the Dutch coast on its way home. It was a short Sterling, a heavy four-engine machine, and it belonged to No. 7 Squadron, and it had been over Cologne. There were 7 men in it. Somewhere over occupied Holland it was caught, and it came down near a town called Hendrik Ido Ambacht, about 8 miles southeast of Rotterdam. 5 of the men aboard died. 2 lived and were taken prisoner. They were not carrying anything they knew to be irreplaceable. They were young men on a bombing raid, doing the job, going home. But the aircraft was carrying a new British navigation set, a device that let a bomber build a picture of the ground beneath it through total cloud, and at the heart of that device, wired into the transmitter, was a solid cylinder of copper about the size of a thermos flask. The Germans got to the wreck. They got the copper out, and they took it to Berlin. The Germans did not call it a magnetron at first. They called it the Rotterdam device, after the place it fell, and the name stuck so hard that the entire investigation took the name with it. They formed a working group and called it the Rotterdam Working Group, and they put a man named Leo Brandt in the chair, and into that room they put the best microwave engineers Germany had, Telefunken, Siemens, the signals men, and among them, as the senior technical authority in the country on this exact question, Wilhelm Runge. Runge had spent his professional life on high-frequency radio. If there was one man in Germany qualified to look at a British transmitter and say what it was him. He had also been part of the world that had decided, back in the 30s, that this whole line of work was a dead end. Now he was looking at the dead end, and it was sitting on his bench, and it was finished, and it worked. Look at the object itself for a moment, because the object is the story. It was a cylinder of solid copper, about 3 inches through and 8 inches long. Machined into that copper block, arranged in a ring around a central column, were 8 cavities, just 8 holes, cut with precision, each one the same. Around the whole assembly sat permanent magnets, heavy ones, throwing a field through the middle of it. That is the whole invention. There is nothing else. No exotic material, no secret alloy, no component that a German machine shop could not have produced any day of the preceding 10 years. Here is what it did. You pour electrons off a hot wire in the center. The magnetic field will not let them fly straight, so instead of crossing to the outer wall they curve, and they smear out into a rotating spoke of charge, and that spoke sweeps past the mouths of the 8 cavities like a finger dragged across the necks of 8 bottles. Each cavity rings. And because they all ring together, locked in step, the whole block sings at one frequency with a voice out of all proportion to its size. That was the trick the world had been trying to find. Not a way to make centimeter waves. Everybody could make centimeter waves. A way to make them loud. The German team put power into it and measured what came out. 13,000 volts going in, 3,300 megahertz coming out. A wavelength of 9.1 centimeters, and a peak power of about 40 kilowatts. 40 kilowatts, out of a lump of copper you could hold in 2 hands. There was a second measurement, and it was the one that turned the room cold, because once you have the wavelength, the rest is arithmetic that any officer in that building could do in his head. Mitox listened to the meter band. It covered the region around 1.5 meters, give or take, and it covered it well, and it covered the entire range of British aircraft radar that anyone in Germany had ever encountered. This thing was working at 9.1 centimeters. That is roughly 16 times shorter, not a little outside the window, not at the ragged edge where a good receiver might catch a harmonic on a quiet night. Completely, categorically outside. You could fly an aircraft carrying this transmitter directly over a submarine, flood it with energy, hold it on the screen, watch it grow, and the wooden cross on the bridge would hear nothing at all, and the loudspeaker below would stay silent, and the officer of the watch would go on scanning the horizon with his binoculars because his instrument had told him the sky was empty. Mitox was not broken. Mitox had never been broken. Mitox was a superb piece of engineering, perfectly built, perfectly maintained, working exactly to specification, listening with total fidelity to a part of the spectrum where the enemy had stopped living. The men on the bridge would trust it. That was the point. They would trust it right up until the water opened up around them. And then Runge's people looked closer at the copper and found something worse than the physics. They looked at the machining. They looked at the strapping that tied the cavities together and held them in step. They looked at the seals, the finish, the tolerances, the way the thing had been put together, and what they were reading in that metal was not the signature of a laboratory. Laboratories make one. They make it beautifully and slowly, and they make it once. This had come off a line. The British were not experimenting with this device. The British had finished experimenting with this device and had solved the manufacturing and were now producing it in numbers and were installing it in aircraft and were flying those aircraft over Germany, and one of them had fallen into a Dutch field only because of the ordinary bad luck of war. Which raised the question that hung over everything that followed. If this was what they had lost, what did they still have? On the 22nd and 23rd of February 1943, over 2 days, the working group sat down and put it in writing. The findings were not softened. Germany was behind. Not behind by a season, not behind by a clever trick that a crash program could close before summer, behind by years, in a field Germany had believed itself to lead, and behind in the one dimension that could not be fixed by courage or urgency or a personal order from Berlin, which was time. There was no countermeasure, not a poor one, not an interim one. Nothing existed anywhere in Germany that could hear 9 centimeters, and building a receiver that could would mean building an entire microwave industry Germany had chosen not to build, and then testing it, and then producing it, and then fitting it to every boat in the fleet. Even the copy was out of reach. Germany did eventually build one, a direct clone. It came out at about 5 units a month. The magnets defeated them, because the magnets needed cobalt, and Germany did not have cobalt in the quantities required, and so the few copies they did complete were fitted with permanent magnets, stripped out of crashed and captured Allied aircraft. Read that sentence again. The most advanced technical program in wartime Germany was scavenging its critical components off the enemy's wreckage. And there was one more conclusion, the coldest one in the document, and it came from simply looking at the calendar. If the British were in mass production of a 9-centimeter set now, then the British had frozen this design a long time ago, and British laboratories had not spent the intervening period asleep. Whatever Germany eventually built to counter this would be built to counter something the enemy had already moved past. They were right about that too, every word of it. It was the most accurate technical assessment produced in Germany that year. And the men in that room understood something else, something that went far past submarines, and it is worth stopping on, because it explains why the mood in that building was what it was. Germany was a radar nation. Germany had radar on the cliffs of France, sweeping the Channel. Germany had radar boxes stitched in a belt across the Low Countries, feeding night fighters onto bomber streams in the dark. Germany had radar on her cruisers, and radar bolted to her anti-aircraft batteries, telling the guns where to throw the shells. It was a vast estate, built over a decade, and by the standards of the meter band it was excellent. Every last piece of it was meter band, which meant that the copper cylinder on Runge's bench was not a naval problem, and it was not an Air Force problem, and it was not a Baltic problem, or a Biscay problem. It was a message addressed to every German who would ever be looked for by an enemy. It said that the entire national investment in seeing and being seen had been made in one part of the spectrum, and that the enemy had quietly relocated to another part of it, and had furnished it, and had moved in. There were men in that room who had spent 15 years of their working lives on equipment that was, as of that afternoon, a generation out of date. They had not been lazy. They had been superb. They had simply been superb at the wrong thing, on the strength of a decision made years earlier by people who had every reason to believe they were being sensible. That is the part that does not get said often enough about technical defeat. It rarely arrives as a failure. Usually it arrives as a success that stopped being relevant while nobody was looking at it. And here is the thing that makes this story different from every other story about a captured secret. On the 23rd of February 1943, when Runge and Brandt and the rest of them signed off on that verdict, the weapon they were describing was not killing German submarines. It was not killing anything. It was not out there. The set they had pulled out of that Sterling was a bombing aid. It was built to let a bomber see a coastline through cloud. The Sea Search version, the one that would find a conning tower in the black, existed, but it existed the way a program exists. A pair of sets had gone to a maintenance unit in December and been fitted into aircraft, and then in January the priority had been pulled away and handed back to Bomber Command, because Bomber Command wanted to bomb Germany and the submarines were somebody else's problem. Through the whole of February, while German engineers were writing the most prophetic document of their careers, the number of aircraft flying anti-submarine patrols with a centimetric radar was 0. Runge had not explained the losses. Runge had described the future. He had on his bench, in his hands, a perfect and complete account of exactly how the Battle of the Atlantic was going to be lost, delivered before the losing had started, to a navy that could not have acted on it even if every word had been believed. Because ask yourself what the useful order would have been. Signal every boat at sea that there exists a radar they cannot hear. And then what? They still have to cross the bay. They still have to surface to charge. They still have to run on the diesels to reach the convoy, or they will never reach anything. You have not given them a defense. You have taken away the only comfort they had and handed them nothing in its place. You have told a man that the thing in the dark is real, that he cannot see it, that he cannot hear it, and that he must go out into it tonight. There is no version of that signal that is a kindness. And there was one more thing standing between the copper block and the men who needed to know about it, and it was not malice, and it was not stupidity, and it is probably the most ordinary force in any war. The bomber had come down over Holland. Holland was the Air Force's ground. The wreck was the Air Force's find, and the working group was full of the Air Force's industry, and the men writing the report were writing about a bombing aid that had been used to attack German cities, because that is what the device in front of them was for. That was not a conspiracy. That was simply the shape of the thing. A navigation set had fallen out of the sky, and the people who cared about navigation sets took it apart. Meanwhile, the men who would die of it were on the far side of France, in a bay, at night, on a boat. The information was not hidden from them. It was worse than hidden. It was public, inside Germany, in a signed technical document, in the hands of people who had no particular reason to run down a corridor with it, because on the 23rd of February, there was nothing to run about. No German had yet been killed by this. The submarines were doing fine. The submarines, in February of 1943, were about to have the best month they would ever have, and then it started. March of 1943 arrived, and if you had shown Dönitz nothing but the tonnage figures for that month, he would have told you he was winning the war. In the middle of March, two convoys, running the North Atlantic close enough together to become one enormous target, were caught by his wolf packs. The battle burned for 4 days across the 16th to the 20th. It was the largest convoy action of the entire war. When it ended, the submarines had sunk 22 merchant ships, nearly 147,000 tons of shipping, dragged down into the black water with everything in their holds. Picture what those 4 days actually were. A merchant convoy is not a fleet. It is a farm town moving at walking pace across an ocean. Freighters and tankers full of oil and steel and food and men, holding station in ranks, at a speed set by the slowest hull in the formation. Around the edges, a thin ring of escorts, and underneath, and ahead, and behind, in the dark, closing from every quarter over 4 nights, the boats. A tanker goes, and the whole sea lights up orange, and the ships behind her have to steer through it. A freighter takes a torpedo amidships and is gone in 90 seconds, and there is no stopping, because a ship that stops to pick up swimmers is a ship that is next. Men in the water watched their own convoy sail away from them. Everybody aboard understood the arithmetic, and nobody could do anything about it. 4 days of that. It cost the Germans exactly 1 submarine. 1. She was caught on the 19th by an American-built bomber flying with a British squadron, and she went down with all 47 men aboard, and she was the only pin Dönitz had to move to black in the greatest convoy battle in history. In London they went quiet. The Admiralty would later admit, in its own internal language, that the Germans had never come nearer to cutting the thread between Britain and America than they came that March. So the plot in front of Dönitz said one thing, and it said it in the loudest voice numbers can use. The strategy works. The boats work. The tactics work. Build more of them and press harder. The plot was lying. Not because anyone had faked it, but because the evidence of a system is always a report on the past, and the thing that was going to kill his fleet had gone operational 2 weeks earlier, and had not yet had time to show up in the arithmetic. A man whose job it was to read that arithmetic sat at a desk in the submarine headquarters, and his name was Günther Hessler, and he had been the first staff officer there since late 1941. He had commanded a boat himself, and commanded it brilliantly, 21 ships sent to the bottom across his time aboard her, including the single most successful war patrol any German submarine ever made. Now he did the harder work, which was to sit still and read every combat report that came in and try to find the shape hiding inside them. Hessler was also married to Ursula Dönitz. He was the admiral's son-in-law. There is a detail from earlier in the war that tells you everything about the household this story takes place in. When Hessler earned the Knight's Cross, the paperwork should have crossed his father-in-law's desk, and Dönitz would not sign it. Not because Hessler had not earned it, because Hessler had married his daughter, and Dönitz would not have it said that a Dönitz gave a decoration to a Dönitz. Raeder had to sign it instead. Remember that. A man so rigid about the appearance of favor that he would not put his own name on a medal his son-in-law had bled for. Hold on to it, because before this spring is over it is going to cost him something no medal could balance. And that spring the headquarters itself moved. It had been in the Bay of Biscay once, in a villa near Lorient, close enough to the boats that Dönitz could stand on the quay and meet them coming home and look at the faces. That had ended when British commandos came ashore at Saint-Nazaire and made it plain how exposed the coast was. So it had gone back to Paris. And now, in March of 1943, with Dönitz running the whole Navy, the headquarters came to Berlin. Berlin, the same city where the copper block was. They were in the same town now. The men who knew and the man who needed to know were breathing the same air, a short drive apart, and the answer still did not travel, because there was still no answer, only a diagnosis, and a diagnosis without a treatment is just a more precise way to describe a death. On the night of the 1st of March going into the 2nd, the Royal Air Force came to Berlin. Bombs came down across the city, and one of the places they came down on was the Telefunken Works. And in the Telefunken Works, in a laboratory, on a bench, Under guard sat the Rotterdam device. It burned. The single most valuable object in German technical intelligence, the physical proof of everything Runge had written, the only 9-centimeter magnetron in the possession of the German Reich, was destroyed by the exact weapon it had been taken from. And then, on that same raid, over that same city, on that same night, the Germans shot down another bomber. They went to the wreck. They cut it open. There was another one inside. Almost nothing in this war was as pitiless as that. Within days, the Germans had a replacement, delivered by the enemy, from the raid that had destroyed the original. The universe was not being merciful, and it was not being cruel. It simply did not care, and it kept handing Germany the answer, over and over, because the answer had stopped being scarce. The British had so many of these things that they were losing them faster than the Germans could study them. And on that same night of the 1st of March, 600 miles to the west, a Royal Air Force squadron at a station in Devon put an aircraft into the air over the Bay of Biscay, carrying a centimetric radar on an operational patrol for the first time in the history of the world. 3 nights later, one of its Wellingtons found something. On the 4th of March 1943, that aircraft was working the bay in the dark. Below it, on the surface, running her diesels, was a submarine numbered U-333. She had her Biscay cross-up. She had her watch on the bridge. She had her METOX listening, and the men aboard her had every reason on earth to believe that a listening METOX meant a safe sky, because that had been true for 3 months, and there was not one man in the German Navy who had been told otherwise. The record of what happened next is very plain and very short. The lookouts were caught unawares. The first thing any of them knew about it was the light. The Wellington came in low with its searchlight burning and laid 2 depth charges across her. One did not go off. The other struck the boat and bounced away into the sea without exploding. That is the entire reason anyone aboard lived through the next minute. As the aircraft passed over, the submarine's gunners got onto it, and it went into the water in flames, and all 6 of the men in it were killed. 6 British airmen died in the opening days of the thing that would win the Atlantic. Now, I am not going to tell you that the METOX stayed silent that night, because the record does not say so, and there are enough people willing to tell you things the record does not say. Here is what the record does say. Men who were awake and looking and equipped with the finest early warning gear their country could give them did not know an aircraft was there until it turned a searchlight on them from close enough to bomb. That was the sentence that would repeat itself, in one form or another, for the next 2 years. 9 days after the finest engineers in Germany had signed a document explaining precisely why that had just happened and explaining it in language a schoolboy could follow, a German crew learned it the other way, in the dark, in the water, with the deck jumping under them. The knowledge was in Berlin. The men were in the bay, and nothing crossed the gap between them, because there was nothing to send, because knowing changes nothing when there is no answer attached to it. Through the rest of March, and through April, the aircraft multiplied, 12 and then more, every one of them carrying a transmitter Germany could not detect, over water Germany had to cross. The boats went out. They went out because that is what boats do, and because the men aboard them had been told the sky was empty when their instrument said empty. They went out into a bay that had beaten the Royal Air Force for 3 straight months, and had now, quietly, without any announcement anyone could hear, stopped being theirs. And out in the Atlantic, the last thing that had been protecting them was about to go as well. Then it was May. May of 1943 did not go wrong for the German Navy. It fell apart. And it is important to say plainly what actually happened, because the easy version of this story, the version that ends with a copper block and a clever Englishman, is not true, and the men who died deserve better than a neat ending. The radar was real. The radar was decisive. The radar was not alone. Everything the Allies had been building for 3 years came due in the same few weeks. Escort carriers, so that a convoy carried its own aircraft into the middle of the ocean. Support groups, spare warships whose only job was to run to whoever was in trouble. Direction finders that could take a bearing on a submarine the instant she opened her radio. Code breakers. Better crews, better doctrine, better weapons. And above all this, the one that mattered most. For 3 years there had been a hole in the middle of the Atlantic that no aircraft could reach, and every convoy had to cross it alone. And the wolf packs lived in it and hunted in it because it was the only place left where a man on a bridge could look up and know the sky was empty. In May of 1943, the long-range bombers finally arrived in numbers, and the hole closed. The submarines lost the dark. Then they lost the last place with no sky. It started at the end of April, with a slow convoy plodding through filthy North Atlantic weather. You have to picture that ocean in the spring. It is not the sea a man imagines when he hears the word. It is gray on gray, freezing, running heavy, with a wind that takes the tops off the swells and throws them flat across the water. A submarine on the surface in that is a wet steel splinter with 4 men lashed to the top of it, half blind, half drowned, and a convoy in it is a column of rusted freighters climbing and falling and trying not to lose the ship in front. Nobody in that weather was comfortable. Nobody in that weather was warm. Both sides were simply enduring, hour after hour, and had been for years. 30 boats went for it. They sank about a dozen ships, and for a few days it looked like March all over again, and Nimitz had every reason to believe the machine was still working. Then the bill came in. 6 submarines sunk in that battle. 7 more damaged badly enough that they broke off and turned for home. For the first time in the war, the cost of a convoy battle was roughly the same size as the prize. 2 weeks later came the other one, and there was no ambiguity left in it at all. A convoy of nearly 40 merchant ships, something like 25 boats thrown at it, in 3 separate lines, across days. Not one merchant ship was lost. Not one. Stop on that, because in the spring of 1943, it was very close to a miracle. 25 submarines, a whole ocean, and every single merchant hull went through and arrived and unloaded, and the boats that had gone after them did not all come home. One of the ones that did not was numbered U-954. She was commanded by a man named Odo Lowe. She was on her first patrol, which means the whole crew was new, and she went in against that convoy on the 19th of May, out at a spot in the North Atlantic, near 54 degrees north and 34 degrees west. 2 British escorts, a frigate and a sloop, got onto her. They worked the contact the way British escorts had learned to work a contact by 1943, patiently, professionally, without hurry, and they killed her. 47 men went down inside her. There were no survivors. There is never anyone to pick up. If you have never thought about what that sentence contains, think about it once. A submarine does not sink like a ship. There is no deck to stand on, no boats to swing out, no order to abandon. There is a steel tube, and the sea is on the other side of it, at a pressure that increases with every meter, and when the hull opens it does not fill. It arrives. Whatever is left of the boat keeps going down, and the men inside go down with it, and it takes a long time to reach the bottom, and then it is over, and the surface closes, and there is nothing up there at all. No wreckage worth the name. No oil slick that lasts the night. The escorts listen for a while, and then they turn back to the convoy, because the convoy is the job. That was the ending. All 47 of them, together, on their first time out. Among the 47 was a Lieutenant Zurzi, a watch officer, on his first war patrol. He was 21 years old. His name was Peter Nimitz. He was the Admiral's youngest son. The news went to Berlin. And what happened next is, I think, the hardest thing in this entire story, because there is no document that tells us what Karl Nimitz felt, and anyone who claims otherwise is selling you something. There is no diary entry, there is no confession, there is only the record of what he did. He did not stop, he did not stand the campaign down, he did not take leave, he did not go home to his wife. He went back to the plot. Think about the man we met at the beginning, the one who would not sign his own son-in-law's medal because of how it might look. That was not coldness. That was a rule he had built himself out of, and the rule did not have an exception clause, and it did not have one now. There were still 40,000 men in his submarine service, and they were still at sea, and they were still his, and a man who stops for his own grief in front of 40,000 other people's sons has stopped being their commander. So he stayed at the board, and he looked at the black pins, and there were so many now. 5 days later, on the 24th of May, 1943, Karl Dönitz signed the order. The boats were to come out of the North Atlantic. All of them. They would withdraw to the south and west, to the waters around the Azores, and the great convoy war on the northern route, the campaign he had built his whole professional life to fight, the one thing Germany possessed that could actually have beaten Britain, was over. He did not call it a defeat. He called it temporary. He wrote that it would resume when the boats had better equipment, and he genuinely meant it, and it never happened. When they counted the month, roughly 41 submarines were gone. Dönitz's own tally was 34, because he counted only the Atlantic. It hardly matters which number you use. Somewhere between a quarter and a third of his operational strength had been erased in 3 weeks, most of it from the air. That is the figure that tells you what really killed the wolf packs. Not a wavelength on its own. Aircraft. Aircraft that could now be everywhere and could now see. And there is one last turn of the knife, and it came that August. German engineers, still hunting for the leak, ran tests on the Mitox set itself, and they found that the thing did radiate. A receiver of that design leaks a little energy back out of its own aerial, and the test said the leak was strong. So the conclusion was drawn, and the order went out, and across the fleet the crews were told to switch the Metox off, because the enemy might be homing on it. The enemy was not homing on it. The enemy had never homed on it. The enemy had 10-centimeter radar and did not need to. So the German submarine service, having spent a year trusting a detector that could not hear the thing hunting it, spent the next stretch of the war with even that detector turned off, on account of a danger that did not exist. They blinded themselves twice. Once by accident and once on purpose, out of fear of the wrong ghost. The help came, eventually. In September of 1943, 7 months after the working group filed its report, German boats began going to sea with a receiver that could hear 9 centimeters. It was called Naxos, and it worked. By then, Allied laboratories had moved to 3 centimeters. Runge's last prophecy, the coldest paragraph in the whole document, the one that said that whatever Germany built would be built to counter something the enemy had already left behind, came true exactly on schedule. Germany spent the rest of the war chasing a tail light, and every countermeasure she managed to field was obsolete on the day it arrived, and the men aboard the boats knew it. Of roughly 40,000 men who served in the German submarine arm, about 28,000 were killed, near 70%. Nothing else in that war on any side in any uniform came close. And the copper block? Germany did build a copy, about 5 units a month, fewer than 1,000 across the entire war, and the magnets for them were cut out of crashed Allied aircraft because the cobalt had run out. The Allies built theirs by the tens of thousands. That is the whole war in one comparison. Not bravery, not genius. 2 countries looked at the same lump of copper, and one of them could make it and one of them could not. There is one more thing, and then we are done. Almost exactly 1 year later, on the 13th of May 1944, Karl Dönitz's other son was killed. His name was Klaus. He had been pulled out of combat duty after Peter died, kept safe, kept back, because the family had already paid. He talked his way onto a fast attack boat anyway, for one operation, off the English coast. It was sunk. He died on it. It was his 24th birthday. So go back to that laboratory bench in February of 1943 and put yourself next to Wilhelm Runge with the magnifying glass in his hand. He is holding the answer. He is holding it before the question has even been asked. He understands it faster and more completely than almost anyone in Europe. He writes it all down, and every word is right, and the report is filed, and it is read, and it is believed. And a boy of 21 still goes into the water in the North Atlantic, hundreds of miles from any land, inside a steel tube with 46 other men. Knowing was never the hard part. Knowing in time, that was the hard part. That was always the hard part. And nobody in Germany ever did.